In this final lecture, I want to share a little bit about my own experience working in the international system, and also suggest ways in which you might become involved in the various institutions and processes that we've talked about during the course. And I'll do this institution by institution, starting with the UN system. So, the UN DRIP negotiations, I spent the last 4 or 5 years as an advisor to the US delegation. And one of the things that I learned going back and forth to Geneva and spending large blocks of time there participating in these negotiations was that, at least for purposes of the UN DRIP, there was a very large, strong, and well-coordinated indigenous presence. Lots of organizations, some individual tribes sent delegations to represent their tribe's interests within the negotiation process. And for large segments of the discussions, indigenous voices dominated the discussion. And the input from indigenous peoples, I think, had a lot to do with the way that the document finally emerged from ultimately the General Assembly's adoption process. So I applaud those groups who participated and would encourage you all to keep your eyes open for similar opportunities should other instruments be under negotiation at the UN and an indigenous voice be welcomed. For the purposes of the UN DRIP, since it's been adopted, since the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, the 4 no votes, have all switched to yes votes, we're now in a slightly different phase, which is a phase of education and implementation. Implementation you can participate in by encouraging your congressional reps to adapt American law or Canadian law or whatever your state happens to be to the rights enshrined in the text of the UN DRIP. If there are inconsistencies between domestic law and the Declaration, it's an easy advocacy position to take. Your language is already written for you. Other forms of implementation can include using the DRIP in legal arguments and in court and making the argument that it's evidence of customary international law. That's happening already. And then on the education side, there's an enormous amount of work still to be done. The day that it was adopted by the US in 2010, or support was voiced by President Obama in December of 2010, I would bet that a small minority of indigenous leaders in the Western Hemisphere were closely familiar with the terms of the Declaration, but that number has grown enormously since that time. But you'll still meet loads of people who have either never heard of it or don't understand how it works, where it came from, or what it says. And so there's another role to play, which a lot of us who are invested in this field spend a lot of time doing anyway. And I invite you to join, which is educating people about the existence of the UN DRIP, as well as others of the instruments that we've talked about in the course. There is a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, as we've discussed. That rapporteur will change, but will always include among his or her responsibilities making country visits. So if the rapporteur comes to your country and schedules public meetings, by all means go. Talk to them, share your community's concerns. It's the easiest way to get that information to the United Nations. Communicate as invited with the expert mechanism as well. They're constantly preparing one report or another, and they get their information from indigenous peoples on the ground. And finally, in connection with the UN DRIP and the expert mechanism, etc., consider celebrating the General Assembly's adoption of the UN DRIP on the 13th of September. Indigenous peoples all over the world celebrate the 13th of September as the anniversary of the day the UN DRIP was adopted and became an official statement of global policy. And that's an easy way in your communities to make others aware of the existence of this document and share some information about it. The Permanent Forum is another access point that we've talked about. The Permanent Forum meets annually in the spring in New York. You could attempt to be elected as a member of the Permanent Forum as the nominee or the candidate of an indigenous organization. Remember, half the slots are for representatives of indigenous organizations. But even if not, there are all sorts of side meetings that occur around the convening of the Permanent Forum in New York, and getting into that network is something that might be useful if you had issues that you wanted to raise with the UN, especially most directly with the ECOSOC, which the Permanent Forum advises. I should also say that the UN is moving towards even more opportunities for indigenous involvement in the UN system. And so would encourage you to do your best to keep abreast of those changes, participate in them if that interests you, but be aware that we've got sort of a platform now that's just growing, and I think will continue to grow over time. The treaty bodies also provide opportunities for access to the United Nations system. The CERD, for instance, the Human Rights Committee, they all receive reports. You can submit those reports. The requirements are laid out on the websites for the treaty bodies or the Human Rights Council website in connection with the Universal Periodic Review process. The reports are the way that these bodies get information about compliance with treaty obligations, and are really the primary way that the bodies get information about potential treaty violations. What's happened historically, I think, is that the committees, and here sort of sharing my own experience with the CERD, I was advisor to the U.S. delegation on Indian issues on 2 appearances, and then the next time the U.S. came up, I was advisor to the chair of the CERD on indigenous peoples' law issues. But in each of those instances, the CERD operated in a way that I thought wasn't entirely reflective of concerns that they should have been addressing, because the process favors people who participate in the process, which is not surprising, I guess. But what that means is that certain groups, International Indian Treaty Council is a past master at the CERD process, as is the Indian Law Resource Center, so their issues are voiced, and then other issues sort of sporadically will be voiced, and that means the CERD has access to those problems. But if you have issues facing your community and you don't report, and nobody reports on your behalf, then there's no way, absent some reference knowledge gleaned from a rapporteur's report, which may or may not know about your situation, or if the CERD employs advisors like me, if I happen to know about your problem, I could make sure that they know about it. But ordinarily, the only way that the CERD is going to know about your situation is if you submit a report. And it's not that complicated. As I say, the process is laid out on the website. CERD is race discrimination. The Human Rights Council UPR process is really anything. So all of these, and then the other treaty bodies is appropriate, but all of these are things that you can do. And I would encourage you, even if you don't use them, to take a look, to become even more familiar with exactly how the process works, so that if you happen to have a problem and it can't be addressed domestically, you have an international forum to go to. And understand that these are fora that the states have agreed to. So there's no surprise to the U.S. when an indigenous group suggests that there's a potential CERD violation, for instance, in the CERD. This is the process that they've agreed to. The OAS, Organization of American States, and this would be true for other regional entities as well. If there is a rights declaration in process of being drafted, one thing you can do is to become involved in the drafting process. I mentioned OAS has a draft American declaration in process. If you're interested in participating, I spent a number of years involved in that, again, as advisor to the US delegation, who were concerned with domestic law implications of agreeing to various provisions. I'm not anymore, but that process is ongoing, and if you were interested in participating in it, you could find out how to through again, the Indian Law Resource Center or the International Indian Treaty Council, both of which are active participants and have been leaders in international advocacy for indigenous peoples. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, also available, again, through petition or through talking with the rapporteur about issues, recognizing if you're representing or working with a U.S. tribe, there are limitations on the remedies that you can get because the U.S. isn't a signatory to the American Convention, but it still may be a worthwhile exercise, and again, it's free petitioning. You don't have to have a lawyer. The rules are fairly simple and there are forms. Or meet with the rapporteur as suggested. And then beyond all of these, educate, educate, educate. You now know more than 99, that may be an exaggeration, but I would bet it's pretty high, % of people working on Indian law issues about how the international system works and how you can participate in the international system. Share that knowledge, share that information with your communities, and then talk about whether this is something worth doing for your community. Or if you don't happen to be working with an indigenous community or a tribal citizen, be aware that this is something that the states of the world have agreed to, this system, as a means for resolving indigenous disputes. Barbara Smith, a close friend, longtime justice on the Chickasaw Nation Supreme Court, once said to me, it's a good time to be indigenous. And I want to close with that, but add to what she said, something that she may have implied, that it's especially a good time to be indigenous on the international scene. The world is changing, and I hope you will all choose to be a part of it.